Now I'd like to welcome to the show Jack Salmon, Director of Policy Research at the Philanthropy Roundtable. Welcome to Free the Economy, Jack.
Thanks for having me here, Richard.
So to start with, I'm going to ask you what I ask a lot of our guests here, which is tell us a little bit about the Philanthropy Roundtable, what you all do, and then how your career path got you to where you are today.
Sure. So the Roundtable is essentially a network of donors and family foundations who believe in philanthropic freedom. And so we have several issue areas that we primarily focus on, which include donor privacy, protecting donor privacy, donor intent, which is a very important issue that not many other groups are working on. Um, the regulation of the charitable sector is another issue area that we work on that's a pretty niche area. And then donor advised funds, which are often that they're a charitable vehicle that often comes under attack by policymakers, but they're actually a great way of sort of democratizing philanthropic giving. So that's essentially in a nutshell what the roundtable is and what we do. And then in terms of my my sort of background and my career path, so you can probably tell I haven't got a native DC area accent. So I originally came from the UK. Um, I was studying political economy at King's College, which we call the GMU of Europe, because it has unusually a few classical liberal professors, and they have some classes on Austrian economics and public choice economics. And so I was really immersed in these free market classical liberal ideas when I was in college, reading Hayek and James Buchanan and others. So I was very familiar with all of the sort of academics over here at GMU and other places, the Cato Institute. And so as soon as I graduated, I came over to do the Cato internship. I worked with Mark Labria at what was then called the Center for Financial and Monetary Alternatives. And so I was always sort of interested in this space, particularly the fiscal space, because also when I was in college was the sort of European sovereign debt crisis. And so that was always something that drew my attention. That's what I wrote my thesis on. And so sort of fiscal capacity and fiscal sustainability is something that I've always been very passionate about. And then after finishing my internship at the Cato Institute, I went to somewhere you're familiar with, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and I interned with another fellow Brit over there, Ian Murray, and we were working on issues of financial regulation. So a little different, but related. And I was writing on several different economic issues there. And then I went for my third and final internship over at the Mercator Center at George Mason University, which was somewhere I was always familiar with because, as I said, when I was in college, I was citing these GMU professors. And so now I was working alongside some of them. So I was having coffee with Don Boudreau and writing papers with Véronique de Rougy. And so I spent almost 7 years there, and I worked primarily on this fiscal issue. So issues of debts, deficits, and spending. I dabbled in taxation, hence my latest piece that we're probably going to talk about on tax expenditures. And so this has been an issue that's really sort of motivated much of my work. And now I'm at the roundtable and I'm bringing some of that sort of tax expertise over to the roundtable to get a sort of unique angle. And I'm obviously continuing to work on this issue, which isn't going away, and it's becoming ever more important. And judging by the ongoing presidential campaign, ever more ignored.
Yes, I know it might not be immediately obvious to people who aren't familiar with it, but of course, the tax code has a lot to do with the world of charitable giving. We had our good friend Peter Lipset of Donors Trust on here to talk about some of those issues several episodes back. Um, and a lot of people know there's a deduction for charitable giving if you itemize your deductions. But there's a big relationship there. And so, you recently wrote about debt and sort of the fiscal, what some people are calling the fiscal cliff, the financial situation the United States is in. And our listeners will no doubt be familiar with that because we just talked with Thomas Savage of AIER about how to understand public debt. He had a great explainer on that, on the basics. But you point out recently that sort of the debt held by the public is at 98% of GDP. That's the entire size of the economy. That's a lot. That's pretty leveraged, and it's forecast to be, well over 150% by the middle of the century. And interest payments on the debt are already bigger than our entire defense budget. And we have the largest defense budget in the world. And by the way, Social Security and Medicare have a $78 trillion funding shortfall over the next 75 years. So faced with all of this, it seems like we have two main options, right? So we can cut spending or increase taxes, cut spending, increase revenue one way or another. How should we think about those trade-offs between those two big picture options?
Yeah, that's the big question. And luckily, we do have a lot of sort of empirical literature that has delved into this issue over the years, particularly since the great financial crisis. But I just reiterate first what you said, that the sort of the context for why I'm talking about this issue, why I'm talking about fiscal consolidation. Our fiscal situation is beyond dire. You said 100% of GDP. That's coming close to $29 trillion. That's trillion with 12 zeros. It's crowding out our federal budget, but I would argue even more importantly, it's crowding out the private sector because public funds compete for private funds, which means diminished private investment, which means less growth, lower wages. It really hurts everybody. And it also puts massive upward pressure on interest rates, as we're seeing, which is related to everything from mortgage rates to car loans to essentially anything in which you borrow money on. And so this hurts everyone across the board. So that's like why this matters. And it's only going to get worse unless we do something. And so that's where the fiscal consolidation solution comes in. So fiscal consolidation essentially means finding a way to return our budget to sustainability, and it's finding a way through a combination of raising revenues or cutting and restraining government spending. And there's been a debate about this really since as I mentioned earlier, the European sovereign debt crisis and the great financial crisis, when everyone's debt ratios really spiked. And what the economic literature tells us when it looks at the breakdown between what we call tax-based versus spending-based consolidation is countries that have primarily depended on raising taxes as their proposed solution to improving fiscal sustainability, they tend to fail. Not only do they tend to fail in consolidating their debt trajectories, but they also have much more harmful macroeconomic consequences. So they tend to have recessions because this huge spike in tax increases hurts consumers, it hurts business, and so it's unsuccessful and it's harmful. On the other hand, spending-based consolidations tend not to cause such harmful sort of economic secondary effects, and they're also far more successful. The average sort of balance between spending versus tax-based finds that spending has to make up at least 2/3 of the consolidation. So we would see significant decreases in spending or spending restraint, and then modest increases in revenues. That's the best balance, but it's typically at least 2/3, and some studies go as high as 85% on the spending side. So the focus should always, from the policymakers' perspective who are tackling these issues, should be on spending first, and raising revenues should be an afterthought.
Well, that's an interesting point, and this has become a big issue in campaign rhetoric, where I think readers might or listeners might be already seeing the result of the election. We're recording this just before the election. Uh, but Elon Musk, for example, who apparently is possibly going to be in charge of federal spending in a new administration, not, unclear. But he has suggested that he would cut $2 trillion. If he was in charge, he'd cut $2 trillion out of the annual federal budget. And that's a lot. That's quite a bit. That's probably more than all the discretionary spending we have. And it has suggested what a lot of people who write about taxes and spending have written before, which is that a lot of people who aren't familiar with the federal budget say, "Oh, well, I just cut a big chunk out, and it'll all be, waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Just all the extra stuff we don't need." And one, that's a judgment call, what we need in the budget and what we don't. But most of the stuff that's in the federal budget is there for a reason, either because Congress has made long-term spending promises to the American people, or because the things that money is being spent on is considered either essential, like defense, or is politically very popular, right? The U.S. Congress spends lots of money on lots of different things, but the things that are in the budget got there for a reason. Right. And so even if we think it's a bad reason, and just in terms of political reality, it's difficult to cut a giant chunk of the federal budget all at once, especially without changing existing law that obligates us to spend that. So What is your approach to the sort of um, again, putting aside what we think is the principled small government solution to a constitutional republic, just looking at the like practical reality of all this money is being spent for a reason. How do we get to really significant spending cuts without a sort of like meltdown?
Yeah, while I admire the ambitions of Elon Musk, um, I think he needs to go and read some public choice economics, because the sort of vested interests that are involved in certain aspects of public spending make it very, very difficult to even restrain spending, let alone to actually cut spending. Cutting spending is very, very difficult. That's why I often say restrain the spending growth, because the issue we have is that the rate of growth in our spending is outpacing the rate of economic growth that we have. And so that there is the issue. If we can restrain that growth, we can restore some level of sustainability. Now, that could involve implementing some mechanisms like fiscal rules, like many European countries have done. You know, we often think of the Europeans as these rabid socialists who have uncontrolled spending, but actually many of them have pretty solid fiscal mechanisms for restraining the growth of their spending. Like countries like Switzerland, for example, they don't allow the government to spend more than what they project they're going to get in revenues in the coming years. And their debt ratio has been about 30% or lower as a share of GDP for many years, especially since they've implemented those rules. Even the Scandinavians, with their massively high tax rates on the middle classes, they have pretty strict fiscal rules. And again, their debt ratios are around 30-40% of GDP, and they tend to be either stable or going down. And this is at a time when populations are aging. You know, we often say, well, we couldn't never achieve that because we have an aging population. Well, so did the Europeans. But many of these countries have actually dealt with their debt ratios, kept them at sustainable levels. And so that's one aspect of it. It's having sort of binding fiscal rules, but also they have to be able to cover a broad scope of the budget. Because whenever we talk about fiscal rules, policymakers only want to implement them on the shrinking discretionary part of our federal budget. It would have to be more broad than that. But the other aspect is considering what is it that drives primarily our government spending. Well, actually, it's not so much defense and those other discretionary aspects of the budget. It's primarily, as we all know, who work in the budgetary space, it's the entitlement programs. So it's Social Security, Medicare. And so finding fixes for those programs, I've written about this in the past, about how we can improve the sustainability of the Social Security program without explicitly raising everyone's taxes. And so that's things like inching up the age at which retirees can claim those benefits, maybe indexing it to life expectancy thereafter, changing the cost of living adjustment metric that we use, maybe moving it from CPI towards a chained CPI, so that there's tiny incremental change, but compounded over time, it makes big savings. And so doing these sorts of things would help reduce that growth in the spending that we see. But then the other aspect, I mentioned it earlier when I talked about consolidation, 3/4 to 80% should be spending restraint. Well, what about the other aspect? And so that's where the sort of tax expenditure options come in. I see them as low-hanging fruit for raising revenues without effectively raising people's taxes. So, when we think of our federal government revenue, it's like a giant block of cheese. The size of the cheese really represents how much revenue the government raises, but our cheese isn't a cheddar, it's a Swiss cheese. And so it's riddled with holes. And these holes represent the tax expenditures that exist. These are the exemptions, the credits, the deductions. And so we don't get as much revenue as we potentially could. And this also raises the issue of complexity. I saw a piece by Scott Hodge at the Tax Foundation earlier this year, where he measured that the time it takes just to file your taxes, because of the complexity, because of these dozens of deductions and exemptions, and it costs over $500 billion a year just in the complexity. And so that, again, that's another chunk of cheese that we're losing that could potentially be reaped for revenues. And so I see that as low-hanging fruit. to be able to review those some of those expenditures. Of course, many of them are important, and we need them. Like there are tax expenditures that prevent the double taxation of retirement income, for example. That's a good thing, and we should have that. But there are many that are wasteful, that are effectively industrial policy that allow the federal government to pick winners and losers, which if history is anything to go by, they're not very good at doing that. Many of them are regressive, and so they represent giving huge, effectively tax breaks to the sort of top deciles of income at the expense of the average taxpayer. And so it's redistributing funds from the average earner up to the high earners or the higher wealth individuals.
Well, right.
And
Let's
so,
well, yeah, well, let's get into some of those. We,
sure.
you know, we want to sort of dip our toes into like several of these examples. So that's a good. I really like that analogy of the like the sweater cheese, the cheddar cheese versus the Swiss cheese, because there are big chunks of revenue that you would normally expect that would be coming to the government, but that it's sort of like given back or cut out of what we would otherwise expect because of these tax expenditures. So they're sort of like the term expenditures sort of suggests that they are like spending government spending through the tax code, just sort of in reverse. Um, so of the ones you've written about several of these recently, and so one of them is the low income housing tax credit. So that costs what 14.5 billion dollars a year, something like that. And but Jack, that sounds like a good one because you don't want to kick low income people out of their housing, do you? Do you want everyone to be homeless?
So getting back to, I mentioned earlier public choice economics. Policymakers are very good at coming up with cute, squishy names for these programs that do nothing like what the title of the program would suggest they do. And so low income housing tax credit is one of these expenditures. So the program was created in the 1980s, and it's effectively a tax credit from the federal government to incentivize housing developers to create affordable housing. Uh, One of the issues is that it's based on estimated costs. And so, of course, housing developers have an incentive to inflate the estimated costs. And there have been several empirical studies on the sort of pricing of low-income housing tax credit produced housing units that compare them to market-produced housing units. And so a lot of them are focused on California, but there are others that look at different states. And what they typically find is that housing units, both in terms of nominal costs, but also per square foot, cost between 20 to 40% more than market rate housing. And so immediately this idea of, the name of the program, low income housing tax credit, they actually produce houses that are more expensive than the market would produce in the absence of this credit. So it becomes clear quite quickly that this is quite deceiving in its name. But also it's been compared to other sort of programs for providing low income housing, one of which would be vouchers. And again, it finds that they're more expensive when produced through the low income housing tax credit. But other than inflating the cost of housing, the other aspect of this tax expenditure is how it actually crowds out much of the private provision of housing. So it effectively acts as a substitute. And so housing that would have been provided by the market at zero cost to the federal taxpayer is crowded out anywhere from, some studies find 70-75%, and others find a complete crowd out. So 100% of houses that would have been provided by the market through supply and demand mechanisms are being crowded out by this government program. And so I recommended in that piece complete elimination of that tax expenditure because it isn't making housing more affordable. It's inflating the cost. Plus, it's crowding out housing that would otherwise be provided by the market at a lower rate.
Well, gosh, maybe we need a Honesty in Government Programs Naming Act.
I'd be on
We'll
board.
we'll run them all by you before they're implemented. Okay. Check. We're getting rid of that one. Okay. Cross it off the list. So next up, one of my favorites, the savory and delicious SALT or state and local tax deduction. So that's when taxpayers can deduct the amount they pay in to some extent in their state and local income taxes and property taxes, and they can take that off of their federal income tax liability. Um, so that was a provision for a long time in American law, and then in 2017 we got the big Trump era Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, big tax changes, lots of tax changes rolled into that, and then so then we said, oh well, you can only deduct $10,000 per year, and some higher income households who live in higher tax jurisdictions, especially in like the Northeast, New England, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, places like that. A lot of households have way more than that, and they would love to deduct them more, but it's like capped at 10,000, and so that's become a big controversial thing with some of our major candidates for office. Uh, Donald Trump that said that he would get rid of that cap, even though he also signed the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act into law. So it's interesting that perspectives shift over time, but uh, but that's one of those provisions we've talked about this before. A lot of those 2017 tax, mostly cuts, uh, uh, will be expiring. And so Congress is going to have to figure out what to do. Do you extend them? Do you not extend them? And deal with the kind of fiscal and economic impact of what will happen with either of those possibilities. The more tax cuts are extended, the less revenue comes in, but the more taxes jump up, the more it might hurt, economic growth and that kind of stuff. So, given that that is the cap is set to expire, which means people will, if nothing changes, people will be able to deduct much more of that in the future, and there'll be less revenue coming in. That'll cost $1.25 trillion in federal revenue in the next decade. So, what should we do about that? Is it fair? This is a very loaded term in tax policy, but is it fair to allow people who live in high tax jurisdictions to take some of that off of their federal taxes? Or should we say, you live in Massachusetts, you voted for high taxes, you shouldn't be able to deduct any of it?
So the the $1.25 trillion is including 2024 and 2025 when the cap is still in place. So if we actually look at the 10 years following when the cap is set to expire, it's actually $2 trillion. So $2 trillion over a decade. This is one of the most expensive expenditures in the tax expenditure list that the Treasury has. It's also one of the most regressive. And so it's a huge chunk of money that's being redistributed up to the highest earners in the most wealthy states, in the most wealthy cities in the country. Of course, paid for by the federal taxpayer. And so this is what I was referring to earlier when I talked about the sort of regressive nature of some of these expenditures. It also actually helped pay for a large chunk, this $10,000 cap of the individual income tax cuts that we saw in 2017. So it paid for almost $700 billion of the TCJA costs. And so without this, the debt and deficit situation would have been far more dire than it even is now. And so to get to your question, your question was about fairness. Well, only 7% of taxpayers actually file for the SORT deduction every year, and they are almost exclusively high earners. So 99% of the value of the SORT deduction goes to households with over $100,000, and 68% goes to those with a household income of over $500,000. So that's almost 7 in 10 who claim the deduction are getting $500,000 a year in income. So this isn't, we're talking about the low income housing tax credit earlier about targeting those most in need. This is
The
quite the
opposite of
opposite.
that.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a hard case to make for this in terms of it being a needs-based program. So in terms of fairness, absolutely to gut this program would be the most fair thing possible. It's also sort of plays into the perverse incentives of determining which types of tax that state policymakers tend to implement. So some states have higher tax burdens than others, and those whose citizens are able to claim in large part the SORT deduction, they tend to raise more taxes in their states because they know that those taxes will be deductible. And so states that tend to have more residents using the SORT deduction have higher tax burdens. There was actually a Mercator study on this a few years ago that found that that it increases state and local taxes by about 13 to 14%. So it's not insignificant. So for this one, in the piece that I wrote on the SALT deduction, I recommended that the most prudent thing to do would be a complete repeal of the SALT deduction. But I also understand in writing this series that there are some things that are sort of best practice, but then there's also those that are more politically feasible or more politically palatable.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that this is a sticky issue for both parties actually. And so I also suggested some sort of recommendations, one of which would be obviously to keep that $10,000 cap. That would be a smart move going forwards, not to allow that to expire as things come up, especially with policymakers making all these proposals for additional spending and tax cuts. This would be more fiscally prudent. This would help pay for some of those additional things. I'd rather they didn't add additional burdens, but keeping that $10,000 cap is first and foremost. But then also, one of the things that I found when I was digging into this is that many states have implemented tax laws that allow their citizens to actually get around the SALT cap. And so at my last count, I think it was 36 states had passed provisions that allow SALT workarounds so that their citizens were still able to claim the SALT deduction. And this meant that only about 80% of revenues that should have been collected under the SALT cap have been collected. It's about 20 or $25 billion a year that's lost because of these state workarounds. And so sort of closing those workarounds would be another way to raise additional revenues.
Those devious high tax states, they just um so the sort of the very asymmetric nature of this, I think, is interesting because it maybe even more so than a lot of these other expenditures where you said the vast overwhelming majority of people who benefit from this are not just higher income, like in the upper half of income. They're in like the 1% or the tenth of 1%, right? So it's almost the exact opposite of what the argument usually is about what we call tax incidence. So like if there's like a tax cut, the question is, well, what's the incidence? Who gets more, who gets less? Is it helping the poor? Is it helping the better off? Um, this is almost entirely for better off people. But of course, the other obvious part of that calculus is that higher income people tend to have more political influence, right? They're more likely to be listened to. They're more likely to be well-spoken professionals who have a public voice. They're more likely to donate to political campaigns and have relationships with policymakers and elected officials. So perhaps it's not entirely surprising that such a lopsided for the rich tax cut is or tax expenditure has been so stubborn and has attracted so many politicians who are like willing to go to bat for it, even though it's not that sympathetic in a democratic sense. But it also kind of highlights something that, what you mentioned, Scott Hodge, the president emeritus of the Tax Foundation. I had him on to talk about his book um, several episodes ago, and he also has some similar recommendations where he thinks we should do away with a lot of these tax expenditures like the ones we're talking about. But he points out in example after example, even ones where it's less obvious, like the SALT deduction, that the majority of the value of them still go to high income households. And that's simply because we have what a lot of people who love the, supposed European model, and think, high taxes are better and the tax progressivity is better in places like, Northern Western Europe. We actually have a very progressive tax system in the United States, and the majority of certainly of individual income taxes is paid by high net worth households. And so, and especially after the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we moved up the standard deduction, meaning that a smaller percentage of people deduct their have deductions where they itemize in the first place. They just take the lump sum and they don't bother taking advantage of any of these because it's better off. And so only the sort of more wealthy people even itemize their deductions in the first place anymore. Which means that almost all of these are going to be the household ones rather than the corporate ones are going to disproportionately benefit the rich because that's who is both paying a lot of tax and itemizing deductions in the first place. Um, so does that itself, that kind of structural background to this, does that change the sort of like politics and incentive structure, where basically most tax deductions are for the rich now?
I think that's certainly part of the equation. I don't know that I can speak to a time in US history, at least in recent decades, where that wasn't the case in terms of many of these tax expenditures that I run through. It's kind of always been the case that the sort deduction has tended to be a regressive program. Whether it's got more regressive over time is another question for additional research, but certainly many of these deductions that I've looked at have always been regressive in their structure. I mean, previous administrations have, for example, the interest, the tax-free interest on municipal bonds is another one that I looked into. And again, it's almost as regressive as the salt deduction. The average holder of municipal bonds has about 6 times the wealth as somebody who invests but not in municipal bonds. And so again, there's this upward redistribution. But several prior administrations had tried to repeal that particular tax expenditure. And so it's always been an issue. It's not something that's just suddenly become regressive. It's always been like that. It may have become slightly more so in recent years, particularly since, as you mentioned, more people have moved away from itemizing, especially as the standard deductions become more attractive for those on the margins. But I think that's always been the case to some extent.
Well, yeah, and I think like with the low income housing tax credit, something that has a like you said, an attractive name, but maybe doesn't quite do its job. That we have this feeling that there are lots of like, I think a lot of Americans have this feeling that there are giveaways, sort of social welfare, whether it's outright spending or it's a tax provision, for poor Americans, and there certainly are welfare programs and welfare and tax deductions for people with low incomes, but that it's amazing to me how much of these are middle class entitlements in effect,
Mhm.
right? And so and you hear this in campaign rhetoric. Occasionally you will hear a politician say something about how we have to help the poor, but I think much more common if you ran a test and did a text analysis of lots of major speeches, you would say this is I you have major political leaders who say, I'm here to support the middle class. I'm here. This is about, we're going to protect the middle class. Um, and that there's my theory is that there's sort of like a skewed perception about how much federal spending is going for the poor and like, oh, those welfare cheats. And there's all these people living off, federal government spending. And the real taxpayers, i.e. the middle class taxpayers are all subsidizing the like, uh, uh, wastrel idleness of the
Mhm.
poor, where in fact, a lot of spending, both in outright federal spending and tax expenditures, are actually effectively middle class entitlements.
Yes, that tends to be the structure. I mean, if we look at government spending in terms of income security programs, so this is not tax expenditures, but actual government programs, a lot of them tend to be needs based, and so those are effectively redistributing money from those um, in the middle class down to those who are in need of some social safety net support. Whereas the tax expenditure programs tend to be quite the opposite. I'd say they're actually not even middle class, but many of them are upper middle class. So the salt deduction, for example, is I mean $500,000. If the vast majority have $500,000 of income, I wouldn't call that middle class. I think that's upper middle class. Um, and so it's completely flipped when it comes to tax expenditures. Our spending is structured in a way that is very progressive, but our tax expenditure system certainly is not in many regards. Even some of the programs that you would think are sort of providing a social safety net or would be more needs based, when you really start to dig into it, you find out that they're primarily going to middle income and upper middle income households.
All right, well, let's take one more of these examples, which is one that I think most people assume is is obviously targeted at lower income people, and that is also, I think, has a reputation. Well, it has a split reputation. But It's the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, as we sometimes call it, and so that comes in at what was it, $750 billion over 10 years, and so this is this was sort of the idea historically about how we transition away from welfare dependency and just giving cash handouts to people who uh, are very low income. The idea is that you gotta work, right? Not just not just the dole forever. And if you do that work and you earn at least some income, you get this tax credit back, and that significantly boosts your income on top of it. And that this is a great thing, and this is the American solution to not just handing out welfare money. Um, it rewards work, and and it lifts people out of poverty, and it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. That's the sort of pro version. Uh, is there an anti argument against it?
So with this one, so with some of the tax expenditures that I wrote about, I was very clear that they're extremely wasteful, regressive, or just sort of picking winners and losers, and I recommend repeal with those tax expenditures. With others, I looked at what the literature says about this program, where there are issues and where there are cases of a lot of error and fraud, and I make recommendations for reform for some of those programs. So this was one of those. So I wasn't recommended that we axe this particular program, but that we look at some of the flaws with this particular one. And you mentioned earlier sort of Elon Musk with his $2 trillion in savings. Well, one of the things he's proposed is looking into sort of waste and fraud and error and trying to make savings in those areas. A program like this would be a good place to start. So as you said, it costs about 750 something billion dollars over the 10-year budget window. So it's quite an expensive expenditure. It was originally created in the 1970s as a temporary program. But as Milton Friedman says, there's nothing as permanent as a temporary program. So within 3 years, it was made permanent by Congress. But it was originally quite restricted. As you said, it was intended to get those on welfare back into the labor market. And so it was quite limited. It was capped at $400, and it was only available to working adults who have children. So it was quite a limited program. It's since been expanded several times through different pieces of legislation. It was particularly expanded in the 1990s. That's when it saw a lot of growth and a lot of increase in beneficiaries on the program. So I looked into some of the literature, and one of the issues with the program is that a portion of the earned income tax credit is captured by the employers of those who receive the tax credit in reduced wages. So the employers know that their employee is receiving this tax credit, and so they reduce the wage payments to them. And some of the studies I found, there was about 30 to 35 cents in every earned income tax credit dollar ended up in the pockets of the employers particularly low-skilled workers who are on the margins. And another issue that I found in the literature is that it discourages labor force participation among secondary earners with low-income spouses, which sounds like a bit of an issue. So when the program was expanded, as I said, in the 90s, that's when a lot of the expansions happened. There was about a 10 to 12% reduction in labor force participation among secondary earners with low-income spouses. So that creates some issues there. But the point that I started with on this one is that it's incredibly erroneous, and there's a lot of fraudulent payments with this program. So I looked at sort of data in the 90s on this program. So the IRS does audits on this pretty much every year, or at least over certain time spans. And in the 90s, in the early noughties, and in more recent years, it's consistently about a third of credits from the earned income tax credit program are paid out in error every year. So the erroneous payments, which is about $25 billion a year in today's money. So that's not an unsubstantial amount of money. So, and I looked at what those sort of erroneous overclaimants were being caused by, and 80% of them were actually ineligible for the program altogether. So these weren't sort of the wrong amount was paid out. It's that these people were not even eligible for the program to begin with. So that's a serious problem there. And so one of the things I recommended for this was to sort of do a deep review of this program. Whoever is running the next administration, in terms of seeking out sort of waste and fraud, this is a program that needs serious attention. But another recommendation I made was I believe to be eligible for the program, you have to have income, but there isn't an explicit sort of working hour threshold. And so that's another area of exploration for this program, um, is to have something like maybe a 30-hour a week working hours threshold for the program.
Well, yeah, and when we were sort of opening this up, and I was a little skeptical when we started about the idea that waste, fraud, and abuse is a major category of spending that could actually be cut. I think people way overestimate the idea that there's just obvious waste that you can sort of cut out of the federal budget. Um, but given the, as you point out, given the sort of astonishingly high error payout rate of the EITC in particular, this is probably one of the best examples where you actually probably could get bang for your buck by spending some time and money investigating, redesigning, and putting the program on a new footing, and you would like reduce that payout rate. I mean, if um, if I was a private employer and somewhere between a quarter and a third of all my payroll money was going to the wrong people, I might I might be a little worried about that. Um,
And
uh,
it's actually worse with other programs. So one of the other expenditures I looked at, I'll just briefly mention this because it's on the topic of error, was college tax credits. And so there's a couple of programs, but I looked at the IRS audits of these programs, and it's even higher. It's closer to 40%. And not only were 40% of payments paid out erroneously, but they were going to, thousands of them were going to prisoners who weren't even students. And so it's really a mess. There's so many issues with many of these programs when it comes to sort of erroneous payments and fraud and waste.
well, yeah, I mean, there's probably some of these college tax credits that are going to colleges that have never even won an SEC championship, which I don't know, that seems questionable to me. Um, so so finally, I mean, sort of circling back around this whole conversation about tax expenditures, the idea that if there's a program that like lowers people's tax payments at the end of the year, we're thinking of that as, as spending, as costing the government money. I know a lot of my libertarian friends are gnashing their teeth right now, saying that's the wrong way to look at this because that way you're sort of intellectually presupposing that all money in the economy belongs to the government by right, right? And anytime they give you a little bit back, they count that as spending. Shouldn't I consider every additional dollar I have to pay as costing me money? Why would I be concerned that I'm, quote, costing the government money, right? Um, and so I think that the difference does underlie, the way kind of two major camps look at public revenue and government, that the idea that the government is the U.S. federal government is sort of entitled to anything it wants by right, and that anything that it lets you keep is a favor it's doing to you, whereas the old patriot 17 spirit of 1776 view is that we begrudgingly allow the government as few tax dollars as possible to get its job done. um, does that uh, are you just looking at it straight on fiscal facts and that's the only thing that matters, or does that kind of assumption about the relationship between the government and the people make a big difference to how you think about this?
You know, I actually take a very principles-based approach to this topic. And I've heard arguments like the ones you just said, and I've heard arguments um, from both classical liberals, conservatives, and people on the left who try to find a way to justify the existence of many of these tax expenditures. But I take a principles-based approach because yes, every dollar taken by the state is government funds now, and it no longer belongs to me, and I know how best to spend my money, and I'm 100% on board with that. But I also acknowledge that while 10 years ago it was possible to consolidate our fiscal finances through spending restraint, we're now in a situation that is far worse. 10 years ago, we only had 6-7% deficits during financial crises. Now we have 6-7% deficits during boom periods. this is only getting worse. But also, it's a principles-based position because um, closing tax expenditures isn't the same as raising someone's taxes. I have never and will never argue for tax increases. But if you actually dig into the tax expenditures, you'll see that it is extremely it's what Matt Mitchell would call government granted privilege. And
Mm-hmm.
so you're picking select groups of taxpayers, those perhaps with the most financial power, those perhaps with the most political power. But also the other side of this is the corporate tax expenditures, which we barely touched on, but it's a huge aspect of this theme. Picking winners and losers, effectively an industrial policy. So corporate subsidies are another huge factor in this. I don't know any classical liberal who could make a good argument for why we should have corporate tax expenditures from a principles-based perspective. And so there's really several different ways to approach this, but I think if we're going to have to consolidate our fiscal federal finances, and spending restraint alone won't get us quite there. I'd rather we pluck the low-hanging fruit that is regressive, market distorting, and effectively industrial policy than have to raise taxes. That's my position.
All right. Well, I'm on board. I get rid of the most shameless things first, and then we can make once we've done all of that, we can make the harder decisions down the road.
I agree. Glad you're on board, Richard.
All right. Well, we're a coalition of two for now. And I think this is obviously going to be a big issue going forward. Um, one, the next Congress is going to have to deal with the expiring tax provisions, and so that's something that's immediately going to happen. And so they'll have to make big, important, significant. Congress will have to make important, significant decisions, and the next president will have to make a decision whether to like sign off on what Congress comes up with. But uh, I'm going to be pessimistic and say I don't think the 119th Congress will solve everything, even if they pass a sort of averting the fiscal cliff tax package in 2025. That probably won't solve everything. So the spiraling debt and leaky tax system in the United States will no doubt continue being an issue for some time. So full employment for fiscal analysts uh, going forward. So relax. I think your services will be in need and demand for quite a while, Jack.
I appreciate that somewhat optimistic outlook, although it's built on pessimism, but I
Uh,
think you might be right.
all right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. And before we go, please tell everyone where they can find you and your work online, and especially the series that you have written about tax expenditures and budget stuff.
Yeah, so you can find my sort of e email or contact details at the Philanthropy Roundtable website. That's where my bio page will be. But my series on tax expenditures is over at Discourse Magazine. So you can find my series there. It is called Tax Expenditures for the Chopping Block.
All right. Thanks again for being with us, Jack.
Thanks, Richard. Great to be here.